Good morning, afternoon, or evening, folks, and welcome to Cast of All Trades, the show where we talk about developing skills, exploring ideas, and following curiosity. I'm your host, Orion Siebert, and in this episode, I'm joined by Rachel Gallagher, a beauty pageant queen, a fashion writer, and a podcaster. What is sustainable fashion? How can our clothes make us sick? How can we better fight for the causes that we care about? I ask Rachel all these questions and so much more. I had such a wonderful time chatting with Rachel for this interview. I was a little worried going into it that I didn't prepare enough and that the interview would be boring, but I'm happy to say that that wasn't the case at all. I feel like this episode was the perfect balance of banter, questions, and answers. On top of all of that, I'm grateful to Rachel, who is still willing to hop on for this interview even though she was feeling under the weather. Rachel was delightful to talk to all throughout the interview, and I could tell we both just had so much fun with it. And if that sounds interesting to you and you want more episodes like this full of banter, questions, and answers, learning about interesting topics that I've never really learned much about before, then make sure to subscribe to the show so you don't miss out on more episodes like this coming soon. With all that said, I believe that about covers it. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Rachel Gallagher. Rachel, it's a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Hi, it's nice to be here. I'm very excited to talk to you today.
So I just want to dive right into it of what is sustainable fashion? How does that compare to other types of fashion in general? It's a topic I know next to nothing about aside from what I've done to prepare for this episode.
Yeah, definitely. So, sustainable fashion is a really large topic. It covers a lot of things. When people say sustainability or sustainable fashion, I think the first thing that most people think of is environment, but it is much bigger than that. So, to break down what sustainability actually is, the word sustainability first appeared in 1987 in something called the Brundtland Commission report. And in that report, sustainability covers development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So, what that covers is everything, including the environment. So, three really important pillars, which is social, economic, and environment.
Okay, interesting. So, built on those three pillars, social, economic, environment, how does
Mhm.
that how does that differ from perhaps other categories or types of fashion that we might see more commonly or that people might
Mhm.
see more regularly?
Yeah. Okay. So your general sort of traditional fashion didn't really have much regard, I guess, for people and the planet. It was very overconsumption driven. So, looking at a lot of buying things and having a lot of clothes to wear. And maybe we don't wear all of those clothes all the time. So, they might sit in the back of our wardrobes, and it's really focused on consumption and not really a connection with your clothing. So within the last couple of years, I've noticed that sustainable fashion has really started to become more common in everyone's kind of everyday thinking. So sustainable fashion takes into account the social, the economic, the environmental impacts of our clothes. And that's a different way of thinking about what we wear and our connection to our clothes than traditionally what we would have experienced through the fashion industry.
Interesting. So when you say that we're starting to shift slightly back towards sustainable fashion, that got me
Mhm.
instantly down a weird rabbit hole of, well, what about historically? When I think
Mhm.
historically about fashion, I feel like sustainability would be something that people really, perhaps not inherently leaned towards, but before a major capitalistic buying era, I feel like sustainable fashion would be the norm, would it not?
Yeah, so if you think about your grandparents' time or even your great grandparents, they didn't consume as much as we do now. They were very much into repair. They were very much into buying only what you needed. Because if you think about the way that the world operated back then, we didn't have things like social media and trying to keep up appearances with other people in that global sort of a way. As well, you've got things like the Great Depression. So a lot of those opportunities, I guess, for indulging in the fashion industry just weren't available. So the way that we live now is very reflective of the way that fashion operates.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm going down this whole education about fashion, not just from you. I've done a lot of research over these past couple weeks, preparing for a couple other interviews surrounding fashion and style in different eras and different topics surrounding it. And I really
Mhm.
am coming to learn how different our modern era feels compared to all of the rest of history. Which,
Yeah.
even though we've certainly had our fair share of decadence and like decadent eras of like opulence and maybe some sections of the Renaissance or in some areas and some industrial revolutions throughout various parts of the world, today really feels so different. Why do you think that is?
I think it's down to a lot of things. It's about having that global sort of mindset that we didn't really have at any other period in time in human history before. So the internet is a really big part of that. That really kicked off that connection and I guess expectations about how to engage with fashion and what that means for the modern sort of person. So a lot of the issues that come in sustainable fashion, a lot of it come from industrialization. So we didn't have a lot of problems like we do now before the industrial revolution. So sustainable fashion is also connected to things like climate change. They are kind of interlinked because of the way that the fashion industry works and also the consumption that we do through our clothing as well.
All right, I'm gonna put a pin on some of that right now. I'll get to some of the
Mhm.
issues involving that sustainable fashion is trying to sort of tackle and fight against. But before we dive into that, I want to talk a bit more about how you came into this. I guess how you had your paradigm shift that led you into
Mm.
sustainable fashion. But even one step before that, what do you think people get wrong about sustainable fashion for the ignorant such as myself who perhaps haven't really had our eyes opened to it? What do we perhaps misunderstand about it, or it's commonly misunderstood about it?
Yeah, well, you won't be ignorant about it after this conversation. I think it will really change about a lot about how you think about interacting with your clothes. So, one thing that people kind of get wrong about sustainable fashion, it's not wrong, it's just that it's hard to connect with the idea of sustainable fashion because it can be quite abstract. So, that idea, like I said before, that sustainability is only about the environment and fashion's impact on the environment. But if you think about your clothes, so right now, the clothes that we're wearing, these clothes have gone through a journey to get to us. So it's gone from extracting the fiber to make the fabric of these clothes, and then the people that put these clothes together. So the garment workers that put these clothes together. So many, many hands have touched our clothes before they even get to us. So it's such a big global sort of phenomenon how the fashion industry works now that it is hard to get your head around, beyond just, oh, environmental impact. It's also the impact on communities and people as well.
Right, okay. I'm starting to think back to some of my business classes about
Yeah.
supply chains and logistics and how,
Hmm.
really, with the advent of massive shipping containers and cargo ships, that we could start to get true globalization where surprisingly it makes sense to somehow send fabric that you picked in South America to Southeast Asia to have them
Yeah.
sew it and then have that shipped back to perhaps up to China and then later to the US or to wherever.
Hmm.
And now it's starting to piece together in my mind of, oh, those lessons that I was learning weren't actually like useless. I know they always had a meaning there, but now seeing in a bit more context, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So diving into a bit more about your own journey, how did you begin to care about sustainable fashion and where did your journey really begin?
Yeah, so I've had a very non-linear sort of career. So I actually started
Don't
my
we love
career
that?
as, yeah, we do love that. I've had a really interesting, adulthood so far. So I actually started out as a English teacher in high schools. So I did that for, a couple of years. And then I just kind of figured out that maybe this career path isn't for me. And it wasn't because I didn't love teaching. I love to teach. And that's kind of what I do through my platform, which is called About Your Clothes, which teaches people about connecting with their clothes in a more positive way. I went through uni to learn how to become a teacher, decided that wasn't for me. And then I ended up falling into fashion modeling. which is completely different sort of lifestyle for sure. So I traveled the world, and I also did beauty pageants as well. So that's kind of how that rolled into that part of my career. So beauty pageants, modeling, and then the pandemic happened, and there was no work at all for models at all, not in Australia where I'm from, because it is a very small industry here. So I was like, what am I going to do now? Like, I don't have any money. Like, how am I going to kind of pivot to get into the next sort of phase of my career? So I decided to bring my ability to write together with my fashion knowledge. I ended up going to fashion school and studying fashion business. And then I ended up becoming a fashion writer, writing for a lot of my friends that owned brands. And then it kind of just extended from there. And I created a really great network for supporting a career transition, basically. And that's how that happened.
Interesting.
Mhm.
One part that you touched on was you just sort of fell into the fashion industry. How does one just fall into it? I always hear
Yeah.
about people just falling into things, but I feel very rarely does that actually seem to be the case. Was there something that like inclined you towards that, or was it really just something just came up and it's like, well, it's here?
Yeah, well, I did a beauty pageant, and then I posted a couple of photo shoots that I did online on Instagram, and then people started messaging me about, oh, do you want to come and do a photo shoot? And then I started making connections, and this is over a couple of years. Like, it didn't happen overnight. So I've been working in the fashion industry for about just over 6 years now. So we're talking about a long-term journey here, and it's still kind of developing as we go, because About Your Clothes for me is quite new. I only started doing the podcast for it in February this year.
Ooh,
And I just
congrats.
recently, thank you. And I just recently came back from the Tasmanian Fashion Festival. So that opportunity came through the networks that I built through beauty pageants and modeling. So it is something that I just kind of fell into, but I feel like it was always something that was part of who I was. I really like clothes. I've always really loved clothes. My grandparents also loved clothes. So a really great story for me that personally connects me to the fashion industry is that my grandfather worked for a really large company here, an Australian brand, and he would travel around to small towns as a salesman for that particular brand. He met my grandmother in a really small town. They got married and had my dad, and then, you know, my dad obviously had me. And yeah, it's kind of, if they had never met because of my grandfather working in the fashion industry, I wouldn't be here. So it is kind of that sort of thing. And then my maternal grandmother was kind of like your unofficial local seamstress. So it's always kind of been in the back of my mind that clothing is something that I've been interested in. But I didn't have any formal training in fashion until, you know, quite later on, after I'd finished university.
Awesome. So it was almost, in a sense, a carry on a family business of sorts, kind of.
Of
Yeah,
sorts, kind of.
tangential way. Wow, that word is hard to say.
It is.
Yes. So that's I love hearing about people's journeys about how they get into things because all too often people gloss over the oh yeah, I fell into it. It just sort of happened. But when you look at it, like, well, it didn't really just happen. You had a network.
Yes.
You built it up over time and oftentimes what I see with people is when they get successful at a thing, people on the outside will say, "Oh, you were an overnight success," when in reality,
Yeah.
they don't see the years, the time that went in behind the scenes of it's X number of years to become an overnight success.
Yeah.
It
I
makes all
try
the
to be
difference.
really, yeah, actually, yeah. So I try to be really transparent about that on Instagram. So I have an Instagram account with a like small following, so a couple of thousand followers, but I do try to be, you know, upfront about what I'm doing and how this sort of journey is developing, because I think it is really important for people to understand the hard work that goes into building something like About Your Clothes or a podcast, or really shifting a movement for people who come into contact with your content. So it is a really hard job, but it's something that, you know, you have to be passionate about and something that you have to be transparent with as well. And I think the world is moving towards that transparency, which you do see in things like the fashion industry as well, like where are our clothes coming from? The same thing, like what is the journey behind, you know, building something like this?
Absolutely, and we'll get into more of that in just a moment. But
Yeah.
I want to talk a bit more about your relationship with that sustainable fashion, and in particular, why is sustainable fashion your quote unquote hill to die on? For some context, we hear about many problems plaguing the world, our society, whatever, whether that be pollution, like polluting the oceans, illness, or something else. But most people just accept them as a part of life. So I guess what I'm really asking is what makes sustainable fashion different for you? What makes it worth taking action as opposed to either doing nothing or taking action on something else?
Yeah, for sure. So it's something that I personally have an interest in. I just found it so interesting to find out how the fashion industry works and to educate people on how that works, because a lot of people don't understand how fashion works. And that's not their fault. It's just because the fashion industry is traditionally very inaccessible for the everyday person. So I wanted to make this experience of wearing clothes and where our clothes come from and the potential future of humanity through sustainable fashion, because it does have that large of an impact. I wanted to make that accessible to people because I constantly get questions about it from people on Instagram or people that don't work in the fashion industry. I wanted to give them that insight because at heart I am an educator. So I think it's very important arming people with knowledge and education about important issues can really make a very big change. It can have a really strong ripple effect on how our future could turn out.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You mentioned how a lot of people don't know and don't understand the fashion industry. And I think part of why that is because the fashion industry is all about branding and images, and they're going to
Mm-hmm.
push the image they want to have. So of course they're not going to talk about the downsides of, oh, look at this flashy clothing that we're pushing out there. Don't look at the landfills that it will cause. Don't look at the harm that it might cause to people. So thinking about that a little bit more, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, well, it's starting to change now. People are questioning what actually happens to our clothes when we're finished with them. What impact are we having on the planet? And because you can see that there are changes happening on Earth because of our impact on the planet. And, some people will say, oh, climate change and things like that aren't real. I've been studying a diploma in sustainable living through the University of Tasmania, which is one of the premier universities for sustainability studies. And I've been learning about climate change because, admittedly, I didn't know a lot about it before. And I kind of just took that information for granted. But to see the scientific results and impacts that we're having on the planet as human beings, and part of that is our clothing consumption and product consumption, is really eye-opening and really interesting, and something that I really want to include in About Your Clothes as I learn more about it. So as I'm teaching people about these issues, I'm also learning about it as well, which I think is a really unique kind of journey.
Hmm. I feel like that's the best way to do it. The best teachers are the ones who are learning themselves all the
Yeah.
time. I feel like that's been the case for me when I'm really invested in a topic and I'm learning about it. Then I can go and teach it and talk about it because I'm so excited to share. Look at this cool thing that I just learned about. There's something
Yeah.
about that energy that just makes teaching and sharing what you learn so much more fun and exciting. But
Yep.
one last, perhaps a little redundant question, but why you? Another barrier that a lot of people that seems to stop people from fighting for whatever cause they care about, whether that be sustainable fashion or some other cause or something else, is that they don't think that they can do anything about it. How did you overcome that barrier, or if you noticed it at all?
That is actually a really interesting question. So, I've always been someone who gets very invested in a topic and then I'll get really passionate about it. And then I'll want to go and tell other people about it, like what you were just saying. So, I've never really had the issue about being shy about what I want to say. So, I love speaking, I love writing. I'm a professional writer. So, I want to use my skills to teach people about important things like climate change and sustainable fashion and how we can contribute positively to our future on this planet. So it's not really like I was scared about talking to people about this stuff. And I think as you learn and as you become more experienced in speaking and writing, you become more confident. So I've never really had an issue with self confidence in presenting this type of information. It's something I've always wanted to do. It just took me a little bit of a while to find how I was going to do it. It took me a few years.
All right, and how did you go about starting to find your how am I going to do this? Because, as I mentioned, a lot of people they want to do something, but again, they don't know, they either don't have the confidence or they don't know how to do anything.
Yeah, I experimented a lot. So I think experimentation is part of the learning process. You have to kind of give things a shot and just give it a go because you never know how it's going to turn out. So my entire career is based on that sort of experimental mindset. So after I finished teaching, I was like, well, what am I going to do now? Let's just go and try things and see how they turn out. So I went and I tried beauty pageants, and then that kind of rolled into other opportunities. And then it rolled into learning about sustainable fashion through fashion writing and the information that I was exposed to through fashion writing. So I've never been worried about putting my opinions out there because I feel like the more you learn, the more considered and articulate you can be with how you approach an issue.
Absolutely. There's a number of points on there that I could dig down on, but I think the
Mhm.
most important one is experience is probably the best teacher there is, and being
Yes.
able to go out and try. And perhaps the real skill is to be able to go out and be willing to make mistakes on things,
Oh, definitely.
because I can't tell you how many mistakes and how many failures I've had through just this podcast alone. There are so many episodes that have
Yeah.
flopped. There are so many verbal tics that I have that I listen back on them and I think, gosh dang it, why do I keep on doing that?
Yep.
So many failures and flops, and yet it's from those failures and flops and mistakes that we're willing to make over and over and over again that
Yeah.
we're able to really learn, grow, and develop.
Yep. It's part of the learning process. So no one's going to get things 100% perfect every single time. I feel like I am a reformed perfectionist because this whole process that I've taken to create About Your Clothes and to create my platform has really taken me on this kind of really strange, wild sort of ride that is still kind of continuing. And I do feel like it's starting to ramp up a lot more as people discover what I do and my content and, come across conversations like we're having right now. It's something that I really want to develop, and it's something that I'm passionate about because I'm so involved with the outcome of this, because we do have a very small window where we can really make an impact on the future.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So now diving into a bit more of some of the topics that came up a little bit earlier about sustainable fashion itself and some of the impacts we had. In preparation for this interview, I was able to go through your website About Your Clothes, pick up a couple articles to go through, and I decided to pick out a couple topics in there that I thought would be interesting to really touch on and dig into a bit more. So,
Sure.
first one, when we think about our health, we often think about like what we put in our bodies, being the food, the water, whatever. Sometimes people think about what we put in our brains, but that's aside the point for this conversation right now. But rarely do we think about what we put on our bodies. Could our clothes factor into our health at all? And
Yes.
how might that happen?
Yeah, definitely. So there are chemicals that are used in processing clothing. So with the creation of clothes, especially things like fast fashion and things like high performance clothes, so waterproofed clothes, water repellent clothes, they can be treated with finishes that give them those performance properties. So that means chemicals, right? So what you're thinking about is the article that I put on my website about PFAs. So they are called polyfluoroalkyls from memory. And yeah, they're just called PFAs for short because it's hard to say that long word, right? So PFAs, what happens is they are forever chemicals. So those chemicals sit on our clothes and they never go away. It doesn't matter how often you wash your clothes, they're going to be there forever. It's the same sort of thing that makes Teflon pans non-stick. So I don't know if you know the history of like Teflon and how that causes cancer and things like that. It's the same sort of ingredients that are used in our clothing. So it is interesting to see that that conversation has happened for like cookware and stuff like that, but not for our clothing. And there are something like 4,000 different PFAs out there in the world, which is a lot of different chemicals that can, potentially have really harmful impacts on our bodies. And in California, they've actually introduced a law that means that brands have to declare if there are PFAs in their clothing, so certain PFAs in their clothing, because it's a health risk.
It's not often I would say California is doing something good, but you know what? For that one, I'll I'll give them a pass. I'll say, good on you, California, for that one.
Yep.
But
They're the only place that I know of at the moment that has this enshrined in their, law, that they have to talk about that on their websites. It's literally on their website. It's in a little, like in the product description, you can see this contains, PFAs, or this contains chemicals that could be hazardous and cancer causing.
interesting. So I think a reason why perhaps people are looking at more of the Teflon stuff on nonstick pans or PFAs and other typically kitchen grade stuff is that we're eating off of these. We're thinking, oh, that little bit of Teflon pan that you scraped off while you're trying to get that little bit of food that was stuck on there.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you're eating that, like, oh, what's that gonna do to me? So perhaps it's the
Yes.
ingesting part that people are thinking more about, and less
Yeah.
the PFAs that are in your clothing. Can
Mm-hmm.
PFAs, like, is it something that can affect you topically, where if they're just on your skin they'll affect you?
Yeah, so I'm not a scientist, but the way that I know that this works is that your skin is an organ, right? It's the biggest organ in your body. So with skin, if you're wearing, let's say, some athletic wear that's got a finish on it that is made of PFAs, your pores open and close when you sweat. So when your pores open, it lets in those chemicals from those PFAs into your body. So your body will absorb, some sort of level of chemical from those pieces of clothing, which I don't know the rate of, absorption or anything like that. But even thinking about that as a potential thing to be happening while you're at the gym, trying to be healthy and trying to, wear clothes to work out in, that's quite scary to think about.
Absolutely. And when we think about all of this, we think about being healthy with our bodies. The last thing we want to be thinking about is, are the clothes that I'm wearing keeping me healthy, or are they doing more harm than good? Which
Yep,
it's wild. There's just
it is.
so much nuance with all this stuff. There was one term that you threw in there in your first explanation about this topic of clothing called fast fashion. Would you just quickly explain fast fashion? What is that? I'm loosely familiar, but for those people who aren't.
Yeah. Okay. So fast fashion is, think of the Sheins of the world. So Shein is ultra fast fashion. So things that are created en masse, they're created out of maybe not so great quality fabrics and fibers. And they're also probably created in developing countries as well. So offshore, from, first world sort of nation stuff. So they're usually cheap clothing. We don't really know exactly how they get to us. It's very murky, and it's hard to trace the journey of the clothes from original origin to us at the end of the sort of supply chain. So the problem with that is that we can't see the environmental impact that those clothing have on the planet, and we also can't see who is actually making our clothes and the effect that it's having on them. Because if you think about fast fashion, it's made with that cheaper sort of material, so synthetic material. And synthetic materials is actually made from oil from the ground. So the same thing that plastic is made out of, this is the same that your synthetic clothing from, Shein and that sort of stuff is made from. So there are, those health sort of effects on the people that are making the clothes with the chemicals that they're exposed to and all that sort of nasty stuff.
Right. So it's not just us wearing the clothes, but probably the people who are making them who are going to be experiencing much
Yeah.
greater health risks from doing this. But you
Yep.
touched on there a bit of what I was going to go into for the next article, which was one of your articles about where do clothes go to die? In particular,
Mm-hmm.
what about the environmental damage? We've touched a little bit on this throughout the episode, but walk me through what the traditional fashion industry does to our environment to the best of your ability.
Yep. Okay. So I just want to throw out there a really interesting statistic from like 10 years ago. So
I love
in
interesting
2014,
statistics.
yeah, I love statistics as well. So in 2014, global clothing production exceeded 100 billion garments for the first time in history. That's 10 years ago. That was before Shein was popular. That was before things like ultra fast fashion really existed. So since 2014, we haven't slowed down at all. So if anything, we're producing and consuming more than ever. So for example, Shein, from what I've seen, rough estimates are they're dropping something like 2,000 products a day.
2,000 a day.
A day. Yep, a day. It's a lot. So seasonality in fashion is basically, non-existent at this point. We used to have, 2 seasons a year, so spring, summer, and autumn, winter, and now we have, new season 52 weeks of the year. You know what I'm saying? So that's worrying.
Well, I have to say, those Shein designers either have to be some of the best, most creative designers that I can think of, or they have to be some of the best at copyright infringement or the best idea
Yes.
thieves there are out there.
Yeah, that does happen. So in fashion, there are no really laws about intellectual property stuff. So that's how Shein gets around it, because they can just, make the same design for a lot cheaper, and there's no laws to protect intellectual property. It's very hard to enforce that, especially on a global level. So talking about the materials that this clothing is made out of, so it's made out of synthetic materials like we talked about before, and those materials can take anywhere from 20 to 200 years to biodegrade. So your unwanted clothes that you don't want anymore and you just throw away into the bin or into the trash, they might outlive you in a landfill in a developing country. So one example is textile dumping in the Atacama Desert in Chile. And you can see that huge amount of clothing from space. You can literally see it on Google Earth.
No.
Yes, you can see it from Google Earth. It's gross. It's really gross. So when that came to light at the time that I wrote that article on my website, that was really explosive online. Like, a lot of people were talking about it. So what the government did in Chile was to start incinerating the clothing in the desert. So what happens is that all these chemicals that are within these clothing get released into the atmosphere, and then they also drift over into neighboring communities and make people sick.
So let's say that someone does have a article of clothing that maybe doesn't fit them anymore, maybe it's damaged to the point of no one should wear this. What
Mm-hmm.
what should we be doing with old clothing or just old garments that perhaps just aren't good or serviceable as clothing anymore?
Definitely. So reuse is something that's really important. So you might turn your clothing into a new type of clothing. So I was talking to someone at the Tasmanian Fashion Festival the other day, and their daughter decided to go and get all their bunch of old jeans. They cut the legs off one of the jeans, and then they kind of pieced together all the rest of the pieces from their other pieces of old jeans into a new pair of jeans, which I thought was really smart. And this person was like 15 years old. So that's quite impressive. And, she ended up wearing this as one of her favorite pieces of clothing. So reuse is really important. Even if it's just parts of the garment, it's better than just throwing the whole thing away and not using it again. Another thing that you can do is donating it to like charities and stuff like that. The problem with that, though, if it's things like from Shein, they're not good quality, so they're not going to last. And then putting that pressure on those charities to deal with that textile waste is really not fair. They don't have the infrastructure to deal with that. Something that's being talked about at the moment in the industry is textile recycling. So what you would have to do to have good textile recycling infrastructure is to actually build that from the ground up. So that would be things like policy and also having the infrastructure to recycle things. There are multiple ways to recycle textiles. You can mechanically recycle it by shredding it back into its original sort of fiber state, or you can chemically sort of recycle it as well. So we haven't quite gotten to the point of doing a fully circular fashion industry, which means going from fiber to product to end of life and then back to fiber, and keeping those materials in use for a longer period of time.
Okay. Interesting. I've never heard of I've loosely heard of the term of circular
Mhm.
products or circular life cycle products, just not necessarily with the fashion industry, but in business and product development in general. But I haven't actually heard much about textiles recycling of the shredding either mechanically or chemically. That seems interesting to me. Have
Mm.
what is there anything that seems to be holding us back from doing more of that, or is this like a big investment thing that just hasn't been pushed into there, or is there something else that seems to be holding us back from doing more of it?
Sure. So, some things I can think about would be investment in it, and also the profit from that as well for companies. So, they might not want to do textile recycling because that's going to limit their sales. So, with sustainable fashion and learning how to live in a more circular way with our clothes, that's going to mean a really big mindset shift, a really big business shift, and also a consumer mindset shift as well. So it's a really big job, and it's not up to one brand or one government or one country alone to kind of figure that out by themselves. It has to be an overarching effort from everyone all across the planet. And that's why sustainability and sustainable fashion is so challenging.
Interesting. There could be a unique business opportunity there for people who do want to start up their own fiber shredding business where they accept either old clothes through donation, they can shred them up and then resell the fiber to seamstresses or to people who are interested in making those new fibers. So for those
Yep.
entrepreneurial souls out there, a new business opportunity for you. Go strike out and try something new. But
Yep.
interesting. There's so much about the environmental aspect of clothing that I was just never really aware of, and it's really cool to learn more about that. Want to move on to the third and final article that I pulled a bit from. Perhaps not necessarily an article that I pulled from, but just a section of your site that I want to talk a bit more about. Could you
Sure.
tell me a bit more about some of the other questionable business practices in the fashion industry that you've learned about, either in practice or in your journey of sustainable fashion? And I have a couple in here that I want to touch on at some point, but just want to see what you come up with first.
Yeah, I think overall transparency is very important for any type of fashion business. Talking about where your clothing is coming from, who's making the clothing, so things we've already kind of touched on before. But what are some of the things that you found were interesting in that particular part of my website?
So, tell me a bit about greenwashing.
Yeah, okay. So greenwashing is when a company decides that they want to tell people that they're sustainable, but they're actually not really doing sustainable actions that are making an impact. So, greenwashing is kind of like saying you're doing something and really you're not doing enough or not doing it in a correct sort of a way. Now, this is a really interesting topic because the Union at the moment has started to crack down on greenwashing. They're releasing a lot of legislation, which is coming out now and in the next couple of years, to start holding these companies to account for how they're addressing sustainability and putting standards in place about what you can say in advertising and what you can't say in advertising because it's greenwashing and it's giving people inaccurate information about sustainability.
Okay. Uh, if you happen to have one at the top of your head, can you think of any examples of like what greenwashing might look like from a fashion company? If not, that's totally fine. I don't want to put you on the spot for this.
Yeah, I have to think about that one actually, but Shein is probably the biggest one. I know that everybody kind of dumps on Shein all the time, and I know that I do that regularly. But Shein wanted to have a more sustainable approach. They said that they were going to work with designers, but just because you're saying that you're going to have a more sustainable business model doesn't mean that you're actually doing it. It's very unclear how they're going to do this. They don't have a long-term plan from what I've seen. It might have changed since I last looked, but they had a sustainability report and some of the information in there was a little bit contradictory. So, and also a little bit greenwashy. So, it's going to be interesting to see the next couple of years how these types of legislation that are coming out of things like EU and everything, how that's going to impact global fashion industry decisions on sustainability.
Interesting. Is there a way for the average individual who perhaps doesn't want to spend hours upon hours digging through legislature or marketing BS, whatever, from companies
Mm-hmm.
to see is to try to determine for themselves, is this company like actually doing the thing they're saying they're doing, or are they just greenwashing? Is there a
Yeah,
way that we could sort of cut the wheat from the chaff?
sure. There are a couple of organizations that look at this, and I've linked some on my website. So if you go to aboutyourclothes.com, I have a resources section, and there's a legislation tracker in that resources section, and they're all free resources to look at. There's videos, there's books to read, there's other websites to connect to. So I've got a couple of ones on there that show you what sustainability should be looking like from a legislative perspective, and also from a consumer perspective, and how to kind of navigate through greenwashing.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I will. So all links we put into the description of the episode mostly will be linking back to About Your Clothes and some of the articles from there. So
Yep.
anything that comes up here, I'll be sure to link back to there. Uh, we already talked a little bit about the garment makers, but what
Mhm.
else is going on there with garment makers?
A lot, yeah, a lot. So if you think about who's actually making clothing, it's a lot of women who make the clothing in places like Bangladesh and countries kind of around that sort of area. So like Southeast Asia, Asia, all that sort of stuff. So um, a long time ago, over 10 years now, so maybe not that long ago, but over 10 years ago, we had a really big issue in Bangladesh with the collapse of the Rana Plaza. So, Rana Plaza was a big building that housed all of these garment factories. And inside of these garment factories were women mostly who were working on garments for lots of different brands. And you can have a look at what brands those were if you look up Rana Plaza on Google, and you should see a couple of different reports on that. But a lot of these brands didn't even know that their clothing was being made in Bangladesh. So, what happened with Rana Plaza is that the building was structurally unsound, and it collapsed. So, it killed a lot of people. A lot of people were injured. And it really shone a light on the supply chain of the fashion industry. So, if maybe your listeners aren't aware what a supply chain is, because it is kind of like a businessy term. So a supply chain just is about where products are coming from and the journey they take to getting to us. So when the Rana Plaza stuff came to light, people in the fashion industry were really shocked. It was really shocking, and it was a really big, devastating loss of life. And it was really sad. So 10 years on, there's been legislation and stuff put in place in places like Bangladesh, and also more, I guess, sort of strict rules about looking at where clothing is coming from for brands to see where the clothing is coming from.
Right. The whole, again, with the rise of globalization and the ability to take your fibers from South America, ship it to Africa, ship it to Southeast Asia, then have them weave most of the clothing together, then ship it to California to have them say made in USA for the last little bit. It's I don't even know a good term for it. It's just wrong in some ways. I can
Yeah.
understand the reasoning behind a lot of what it is, because incentives for companies is to maximize profits, and if it's profitable for them to function in that way, I understand why they do it. I don't agree with it,
Yeah.
but there's certainly a lot of issues there that need to be more seriously considered and looked at.
For sure.
One last topic I really want to dig into in the stuff that was on your website is this concept of design theft. You already mentioned a bit earlier how IP in the fashion world is kind of nebulous, especially when you look at country borders. I do some inventing on my own time and try to invent and license my own products. This is something I have to deal with on my own in a totally different area of intellectual
Mm-hmm.
property stuff. And just from what I know of my own intellectual property stuff, it's irritating doing anything international because the second you put out a good product, China will knock it off and cut the price by like 500% within at least 2 weeks.
Yeah. And the people who are making those products, they don't get fairly paid for that either. So they might pump out, 200 pieces of clothing and they don't get paid nearly enough for a livable wage. And that's another thing that's part of sustainable fashion is paying people livable wages. And what that means is that they can afford to send their kids to school, they can afford to eat, they can afford to travel, like all those basic human needs that we kind of take for granted in Western society. They don't have access to that because the brands that they're working for or the manufacturers that they're working for aren't paying them a livable wage.
So is this going to be the case for like contract designers, independent designers, for like in-house company designers? Is that typically going to be the same for everyone, or is this going to be more like impact the different designers differently?
Yeah, for sure. So if you've got your own sort of small business and you're creating your designs on site and you know exactly what the process is, you would probably have to pay your designers a living wage, right? But if you're mass producing fast fashion, for example, in the ways that, Shein and Temu and all those things do, they don't have to pay anyone anything really because they're operating through other manufacturers that they get in touch with. And the funny thing about Shein is it's actually not a fashion company, really. It's a technology company. So they're actually not making the clothes. They're getting in touch with manufacturers to make the clothes on their behalf, and they are a selling platform basically. They cut out the middleman. So they cut out things like, boutiques and all that sort of stuff. And some boutiques do source and find those clothes from the exact same suppliers that Shein does. So it is very, very murky and hard to get information about where our clothes are coming from, especially those cheaper clothes, those synthetic clothes.
How can we better support our designers for the clothes that we really like? Is there a way that we can better support them individually, or is there nothing out there quite yet for that?
So supporting small business and local businesses is really good. Even doing things like shopping vintage. I love vintage shopping. I'd say probably like 85% of my wardrobe now is thrifted or vintage.
Same.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so good. Like you find things that are really high quality, great different types of fibers, so you can get things like organic cotton or silk or like merino wool, which are really luxurious that people just don't want anymore. And there are people who make it their career, I guess, to go and find these different types of clothing and then resell them on, whether that's through a consignment store or through a small business online like eBay, things like that, or even through Depop and stuff like that. So there are different ways to shop, and it's being mindful about how you engage with your clothing's journey from where it comes from to how you wear it, and then how you dispose of it when you no longer want it, to keep it in use for a longer period of time.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We've gone over so much in this episode about all facets of sustainable fashion, why it matters to you and so many other people. And I'd like to start to wind this down and talk a bit about how can we take action as individuals? What can we do to be more conscious shoppers as we're looking at developing our styles? We're looking for new clothes to perhaps enhance our own personal fashion.
Yep, for sure. So education is obviously a really big one. So making sure that you're going to credible sources for information. So looking at research that's been done by peer-reviewed sources. Also things like obviously about your clothes would be a great place to start. I know that I'm biased saying that, but it would be a great place to start. And also listening to people who are adjacent to fashion as well. So I'm a really big fan of this scientist that I recently discovered, and his name is Johan Rockström. And he recently did a TED talk a couple of weeks ago about the tipping points of climate change. And there's a video on YouTube of this TED talk. It's called The Tipping Points of Climate Change, Where We Stand. And it's about where we currently are and the acceleration of change that we're seeing in the climate which is much more than previously predicted. So thinking about how to relate that back to fashion and things to think about in a more global context. So putting yourself in a global context rather than, just a silo about, oh, I have my wardrobe and, that's it. I don't connect to any other part of the fashion industry or the world at large. So putting on that thinking hat about how am I living in this world as a responsible steward for now and for the people of the future.
All right, fair enough. Finally, can you tell me a bit about your platform, about your clothes?
Yeah, definitely. So, About Your Clothes is a podcast and also a website which aims to educate everyday people about sustainable fashion. What I do is I talk to people from all around the world about different elements of the fashion industry. So, recently I talked to a guy in Australia who is developing a company that dyes textiles in an innovative way with plasma. That was really interesting. If you're into science, make sure you go and listen to that. I've talked to people who work in supply chain. I've talked to everyday people who just like to DIY their clothes. Like one of my friends from beauty pageants, she's an epic DIY person, and I'm always constantly in awe of what she creates. So that as well, from the everyday people to the experts in the industry to people who run small to medium businesses, it's really interesting to see the information that they come up with and the tips that they can give everyday people from their experience in this industry. Other than that, I also have started to run workshops about sustainable fashion where I teach people about the fibers in clothing. So I can do that online, but I can also do them face to face. So that's something new for About Your Clothes, and it's still being developed, and I do have a couple of events where I'm going to be testing that out. So if you are interested in learning more about fibers of your clothes, make sure that you contact me to book a workshop online for you and your friends or your business or whatever it might be.
Any final pieces of advice or tips you want to end with that we haven't touched on at all yet?
I think just being connected to your clothing and making sure that you're making considered decisions that you're putting a lot of thought into. So my proudest outfits coming from, just a fashion lover sort of perspective, my proudest outfits that I own are the ones that took me the longest to find. So I recently discovered a really beautiful Hugo Boss vintage blazer, and it's a men's blazer, but that's okay. And it's bright electric blue. And I also paired it with all these different vintage finds and thrifted finds that were also blue. And I had this entire blue outfit when I was at the Tasmanian Fashion Festival. And I had so many compliments, and I had this great story behind my clothes. And it was so good to share that with other people. And they were so impressed. And I really hope that that inspired them to think more about how to connect with their clothes in a different way to make them feel confident rather than just being part of this cycle of consumption, really being mindful about what you wear and why it's special to you.
Absolutely. I love thrifting for clothes. Most of my favorite clothing is shirts that I've found at thrift stores over the years, and there are so few items that I think, yeah, that's awesome. And I've just held on to them forever. And definitely this has been a wonderful interview for me. I feel like I've learned so much, and I just want to share what I've learned with people. It's been great. Rachel, you've been awesome to talk to. Thank you so much for being willing to sit down and chat with me, even though you've been sick through the episode. I greatly appreciate it.
Well, I
And
hope no one noticed that I was sick, but I'm passionate about sustainable fashion, so we pushed through because it's something important.
all right, if you want to check out more of what Rachel does, go to About Your Clothes for her website, for her Instagram, for a podcast. So much great stuff there. I highly recommend it. I'm definitely going to go take a listen to that episode that you talked about of plasma dyeing clothing because that sounds very interesting to me.
Mm. Yes, it is. It's really cool. So make sure you don't miss that. And I have a few others coming out. They come out monthly. So
Well, I look forward to it. Rachel, is there anywhere else people can go to keep up with whatever it is that you're doing, or do we hit everything?
we hit everything, I think. So the website aboutyourclothes.com. And then you can also pop along to my Instagram, which is at aboutyourclothes with an underscore after.
Awesome. Rachel, thanks again for coming onto the show today.
Thanks so much for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode, then please share with a friend you think would like it, or share it on social media. It would absolutely mean the world to me, and it helps the podcast grow so much. With all that said, thanks for listening. I greatly appreciate it, and I'll talk to you all later. Ciao.